It remained to be seen to what extent, or for how long a period, the encroachments of death might be arrested by the process.
That's a quote from a short story called The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar by the master of 19th century horror, Edgar Allan Poe. It's about a guy who tries to mesmerize a terminal tuberculosis patient called Valdemar. I don't know the ins and outs of mesmerism, but it seems like it's basically hypnotism. But if I understand it right, it was thought to have physical healing potential. You know, it could cure ailments or relieve pain. In this Valdemar story, the narrator thought mesmerism would, according to the quote, arrest death. Stop it in its tracks. Not to spoil things for you, but it didn't work. Actually, it made the idea of dying seem a whole lot worse. I first read this tale in a college English class. We had to write a paper about its themes, what it meant. You know, a higher learning assignment. Didn't think much about it at the time. Collegiate life doesn't lend itself to existential thoughts about immortality. Once I turned in my paper, didn't really think about it again. Until a few weeks ago, when something reminded me of Poe's revolting story and all the messed up things that happen to our bodies when we die. You're listening to Run, Fool! I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 43, The Other Case of M. Valdemar. Before I begin, let me offer a disclaimer. I'm not chasing the fountain of youth, but I am a man of a certain age. And there was a time when I was curious about upkeep. So I went to this wellness doctor. This was a fancy place, some medical startup that was supposed to be cutting edge, an exclusive celebrity spot. And lucky for me, I knew a guy who knew a guy who got me a slot on the client list. Anyways, I got there, headed back to my exam room when the receptionist told me to. On my way, I passed an open door and heard something curious. The sound of weeping. I peered inside. There was a man sitting on an exam table. The lights were dimmed, so he was pretty shadowy. But I could see him sort of look up at me, cock his head, and say,
I don't know what you came in for, but...
I'd come to find out this man's name was George. He was in his 50s, and a few months ago someone told George he was going to die. His doctor. There was a reason why this PhD said that. George had congestive heart failure. End stage. It was advanced enough that it couldn't be reversed with good old hydration and exercise. According to the white coat delivering the news, it'd kill him within a year. Now, I've been in a few life or death situations myself, but from what I've heard, being sat down and calmly told you're about to die is even more terrifying than being chased by some ungodly creature. So you can't blame George for being devastated. But with George, there was a little more going on. See, he hated the idea of his body betraying him. He'd gotten his first gray hair at the age of 30. Ever since, he'd been obsessed with staying young. That meant buying the best products, hiring a trainer, a nutritionist. He was vain. Wanted to avoid the big expiration date that comes for all of us. When you're that passionate about not dying, getting a terminal diagnosis isn't something you easily accept. Lucky for George, he'd never met a problem he couldn't buy his way out of. He was rich, filthy rich. So George fired this bad news doctor and sank some cash into a different kind of medical professional. That's how I found a man who we'll call Doc, the same guy yours truly had scored an appointment with, where I met George. George thought Doc was a genius, maybe because he was a modern-day Dr. Feelgood. Like I said earlier, he served the ritziest citizens of LA, performing experimental wellness and healing procedures that some touted as miracles. All that's to say George was hopeful when Doc promised to work on a cure. That hope took a hit in the weeks and months that followed, because while Doc holed himself up in his labs, working on a fix, George got sicker and sicker, until one morning he woke up to a feeling of intense dread. He felt it deep in his body, like a penetrating rot that festered in his belly and soul. It emanated through his abdomen into his chest. It was so visceral, he quite literally gasped for air. He was devastatingly certain that today would be his last day. It's my understanding that sometimes folks know when they're about to die. That's what was happening to George. Death was coming, like a whisper around a dark corner, one that he couldn't stop his feet from walking towards, no matter how hard he tried. His frail body started trembling then. He'd lost a ton of weight in recent months. Dying will do that to you. So this shaking made his bones rattle. But he told himself to get up, to get moving, to hurry. Because even though he was certain death was coming, he was equally sure he could find a way to stop it. He rushed to Doc's offices, hoping the wellness genius could do something. When he got there, he was basically on death's door. He could feel his organs shutting down. His vision got blurry as he begged Doc for help. And Doc, well, his reaction was a little odd. He pressed a hand against George's forehead and asked how far he was willing to go for immortality. He asked this 3 times, which to you and me might seem ominous and a little unprofessional. But George was too frantic to notice, and too arrogant probably. Because like I said before, George had never met a problem he couldn't buy his way out of. He told Doc he was willing to go as far as he needed, and pay as much too. It was what Doc wanted to hear. After that, he told George about a breakthrough in their labs, a very experimental gene therapy treatment. So far, it seemed to stop the body's natural decay, heal it from the inside out, by literally altering the body's cells. At least that was the gist. See, George didn't care about the science. Doc had him at breakthrough. Moments later, George watched a needle tip plunge into his skin, saw the burst of blood as his veins protested the entry. Doc depressed the syringe containing the gene therapy concoction. As the medicine flowed into George, a burning sensation crept up his arm. His eyes grew heavy. A deep coldness replaced the burn. Like a polar night, it swirled into the exam room and encircled George in its freeze. Then he felt his body slump. Everything went black. George opened his eyes to see Doc peering down at him. George slowly sat up and took stock of his body. His chest no longer ached. He wasn't wheezing. His vision was clear and bright. A laugh bubbled up in his throat. He was alive. Doc told George that they ran some tests while he was passed out. His heart no longer failing. It was beating normally. His other ailments were fixed too. Cholesterol was in check, blood pressure, and heart rate was stellar. Only thing George needed now? Some R&R. That was that. George went home to his palace in the hills, lay on his custom-made couch, looked out at his expansive view of L.A. The joy and relief swelled up inside of him, until it got so huge he let out an exhilarated cry, because he was alive. Over the next few days, George learned that the injection didn't just save his life, it gave him what he'd been lusting for. Since that first gray hair, his youth. This stuff was El Dorado, liquid gold. His wrinkles faded, his hair got lustrous, grays stopped coming in. His joints didn't click like they normally did. He'd been healed from the inside out. If you're thinking all this felt too quick, too easy, you'd be right. When something seems too good to be true, that's usually because it is. One night, George sat in his living room sipping a martini, looking at that stunning view. It was nighttime. The city of Los Angeles was just a series of palm tree silhouettes and twinkling lights. If you listen closely, you could hear the traffic flow in the distance, LA's gorgeous soundtrack. George closed his eyes, feeling a warm, balmy breeze rush in through a pair of glass double doors that led to his deck. The martini was cool in his hand. He inhaled, filling his chest with oxygen, relishing in the way that his muscles felt taut and limber. But when he opened his eyes, he saw a glitch in this perfect matrix. A man stood in the doorway, In between those glass double doors, he was bathed in darkness, a true shadow figure. But George could tell he looked a little hunched over, and when this man took a step forward, he hobbled, like each movement pained him. George got to his feet. His heart ticked up a notch or two. His voice shook more than he'd like. And when he asked this stranger what he was doing there, no answer. He told the man to leave. No answer. George assessed the situation. This guy looked like he was about to topple over. George was basically a young buck again. He was strong and limber, capable of fighting his way out of situations like this. Then the man stepped into the light. His face was wretched. Gray and ragged skin hung in drooping curtains. A shining, vicious fluid covered his cheeks, making them look wet. The hair on his head was almost completely gone. A few long strands hung over his forehead, pressed against the damaged skin, held there by that shiny fluid. It was a ghastly condition, and it seemed to get worse and worse with each passing moment. His cheeks sagged lower and lower, and the skin on his neck rippled, oozing like a gooey slime that was about to slide right off. This man was disintegrating.
You know, guys, I've been struggling with my weight. I know some of y'all see me on Instagram. I've been struggling with my weight my entire life. But you know who's helped me out a hell of a lot? Factor. Because of Factor, you know that sexiness that you see right now? It's all due to them. I know y'all don't believe me, but it's absolutely true. Make today the day you kickstart a new healthy routine. What are you waiting for? With 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, you'll always have new flavors to explore. Crush your wellness goals this month with dietitian-approved meals and ingredients that you can trust. Make your day delicious. From breakfast to dessert, stay fueled with easy, nutritious options. Head to factormeals.com/run50 and use code RUN50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's code RUN50 at factormeals.com/run50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active.
George screamed. Of course he did. There was an oozing man in his gorgeous living room. He kept screaming as the man staggered forward. Only thing that made him stop was noticing this guy's destroyed lips. They moved, trying to mouth something. George fell silent. A soft croak came from the man. He said,
I found you. I found you. I found you.
Before George could ask him why he'd been looking, the man said something else.
You didn't let Doc inject you too, did you?
Then this guy vanished. I don't mean in a poof he's gone kind of way, because George saw exactly where he went. Down. His body seemed to slide away from itself, plunging to the floor in a rotting puddle. Blood and pink-tinged watery fluid seeped out of a pile of human matter that used to be a man, flowing gently into George's plush carpet. A putrid smell wafted through the air, an aroma so rancid George's gut heaved. He unloaded the contents of his stomach, martini and all. He backed away from the mess, coughing and sputtering. A million different thoughts ping-ponged around his head, hitting one another like bumper cars. What he knew to be true was this. A man had just decomposed in his living room. A man who knew Doc. The less concrete thing, the man seemed to suggest that Doc injected him with something, which made George's heart race. Because obviously there was one very specific injection he'd gotten, the one that saved his life, and changed it too. George grabbed his cell. The only thing he could think to do was call Doc, figure out what was what. But the line didn't connect. It didn't even ring. A taunting voice on the other end said the number wasn't in service. George assumed he got the digits wrong and tried again. Same thing. By the 10th time George tried that number, he was in a state. Melting down, if you'll indulge the pun. See, he'd built up a whole story in his head by this point. That the puddle on the floor had also been injected. with Doc's secret gene therapy solution, and George would eventually meet the same fate. George wasn't about to sit on his custom-made couch and rot. It didn't matter that this was the middle of the night. If he couldn't reach Doc, he'd have to go find him. It was after midnight by the time George got to Doc's. By the way, Doc had a whole building in Beverly Hills. The bottom floors were where he saw patients. The top floors were a suite of high-end laboratories, the place where Doc made his potions, conducted his experiments. George took the elevator to the top floor. He wasn't sure what his plan was. It was late. Doc likely wasn't even there. Plus, the place probably had security, but it actually had been easy to get into the building. No guard, no receptionist, no locked doors. And when George emerged from the elevator banks, the door to the lab suite was wide open. Soon as George stepped inside, he saw why. The offices were abandoned. Not just middle of the night abandoned, more like ransacked. Filing cabinets were open, their drawers emptied. Computers were gone. Lab equipment had vanished. George wandered around the suites, peering into empty rooms. With each vacant lab, he felt his panic tick up a notch. His cheeks got hot. It was harder to breathe, to move. By the time he reached the back storage locker, he was wheezing, which was unfortunate because he found something in the locker which made it even harder to catch his breath. See, the storage locker was a cooler of sorts, a massive one, with reflective steel-sided walls. Think of a huge walk-in at a restaurant. Actually, a morgue would be a better comparison, because this locker was full of bodies. Or what used to be bodies. Piles of slimy debris were strewn about the space, bubbling, rotting flesh that had collapsed into sickening mounds, covered in a light frost from the cold room. Bones stuck out of the muck, almost clean, because the flesh had slid right off him. Just like the day of his death, George was hit with an unprovable certainty that these piles were Doc's failed experiments, and they'd all been injected with the same juice, the gene therapy treatment. This thought made him gag, but when he lifted a hand to cover his mouth, shock stopped him in his tracks. The skin was thinner than he remembered. It was also slimy, like it was getting too fragile to hold the contents of his body. Sort of how a soggy, overstuffed dumpling looks. The other arm was like that too. He lifted up his shirt. Where his abs had been svelte and chiseled, they now sagged, as if the muscle had gotten too heavy to hold itself up. The skin pooled around his midsection like a belt. George turned to look at his reflection in the storage room's metallic wall. His hair was shock white and thinning. His face drooped. Big dips of skin hung around his jowls. He didn't look like the young buck he'd been just a day ago. He looked like the guy who'd melted into his floor. George was stunned, morbidly horrified. He couldn't suppress the two words that ripped up in his throat. "I'm dying." There was no way to describe what was happening to him. Death. He was dying. Soon, he'd be dead. Soon, he'd be another puddle on the floor. George stumbled out of the storage room down the hallway. He could feel his body seize. His limbs were both rigid and feeble, which gave his movements a doll-like teeter. He intended to go to the hospital because he was thinking it was time to consult with a real doctor, one who could fix this. That's when George felt the skin of his hand slip off. He looked down in horror. The bloody muscles and bones were out in the open. The covering was now hanging from his wrist, like those mittens on a string that kids wear. George screamed as a stinging sensation tore up his arm. He hobbled towards the elevator, but as soon as he stepped through the doors, his legs gave out. He pitched forward, his body hit the floor of the lift and crumpled. He tried to rise again, but his muscles wouldn't work. A visceral, ripping sensation came over him, one that was so sharp, it took his breath away. It was the rest of his skin saying goodbye to his bones. George choked on his wails of pain. There was a mirror on the ceiling of the elevator, so he could see everything. His skin slid off him in a heap, exposing his thick, bloated organs to the air. The guts and gunk inside him spilled forth, rushing onto the elevator floor. and then he watched his face collapse. His eye sockets stretched out like a jack-o'-lantern, followed by the eyes themselves as they made a downward journey to his chin. His body heaved and quivered. He managed to choke out, "Dead, dead, I'm dead." As soon as the words left his mouth, he watched his lips turn to liquid goo, then drip down his chin. He couldn't speak anymore. So he was surprised when he heard a voice.
George?
Only it wasn't his voice. It sounded like Doc.
George?
It was hard to tell, though. It was echoey and far away.
Where are you, George?
It told him to come back.
Come back, George. Over here.
That's when a strange thing happened. George woke up. Yeah. He opened his eyes, saw he was lying on an exam table in Doc's office, staring up at Doc's face. George immediately lifted a hand. It was normal. Not papery or decaying. Normal. He felt around, looked around. The rest of his body was too. George was thinking, no way. That couldn't have been a dream? Okay, so here's what happened. Doc didn't have a gene therapy treatment. The real experiment he was testing was mesmerism. Right before George's body shut down, Doc put George into a trance. It paused the body's functions, you see. The hope was this suspension of death could heal George from the inside out. It didn't. Doc told George his heart hadn't improved. He was likely still going to die. The reason he woke George up was because George kept screaming, calling out alarming words like dying and dead. So Doc got worried, took him out of his trance. George let that all settle. Doc gave him some time to consider his options, left him in the exam room to think. As soon as he was alone, George started to weep, because of the shock and all. But also, he'd been shaken up enough to realize something. Immortality is impossible. I've said this before, but death comes for us all. And George was just ashamed. He'd wasted so much time and money trying to fight it. He vowed to use the time he had left to taste his coffee, to watch the sunrise, to call his family. Enough, he said to himself. Enough. It was around that time that George saw a figure wander into his room. As I'm sure you've guessed, the stranger in question was yours truly. George told me his story and his hard-earned lesson, that it wasn't worth it chasing youth. He was going to live out the rest of his days appreciating life, taking things as they came. When it was his time to die, he'd go willingly, gracefully. Except, I couldn't really listen to George's revelation, because I'd stepped closer to him as he told the story, which meant I got a good look at him. He was rotting. That's the best way I can say it. His skin hung in loose drabs on his face. I could see the whites of his bone where the eye sockets drooped. The skin on his arms hung down like wings. There was a kind of rancid odor coming from him, too. He must have seen my shocked face because his eyes filled with confusion. He looked down at his hands and screamed. George kept screaming, even as Doc came in and some nurses. They all gathered around the bed and pushed me out of there. I hovered in the doorway, not wanting to watch, but unable to look away. I could see George's hand through the bodies of medical staff. It twitched, rigid, then went limp. Then it sank into a heap of messy, wet muck. See, George's body had indeed decided to die months ago, when he came into this office pleading for his life. The trance had merely staved off the inevitable. And once he was awake, his body made good on its prior promise to die and rot. Listeners, it was the slick, gory encounter that made me remember my high school literature and the similar putrid demise of Valdemar from Poe's story. Except this was a whole lot more horrifying, because it was real. I left without going to my appointment. I was about to hurl. But I also wanted to run from whatever vices I'd been about to dabble in. See, I no longer had an appetite for battling it out with time. I'd rather appreciate the moments I had left. Run Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and produced by Abakar Adan and Lee Mengistu. Editing by Abakar Adan. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. Creature vocalization by Terry Cashburn and artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Coordinating producer is Avery Siegel. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levitt. Executive producers at Will Media are Will Malnati and Rosie Guerin. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.